All right. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Derek Penslar, one of the resident fellows here at the Center for European Studies, and it is a great pleasure and honor to introduce Professor Thomas Weber, well known to the Center for European Studies and to Harvard University for reasons that I'll explain in just a minute. Tom holds a doctorate from the University of Oxford and is currently professor at the University of Aberdeen, but he has spent extensive amounts of time both as a visiting fellow or teaching at other institutions, including the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton, the University of Pennsylvania, the University of Chicago, the University of Glasgow, and most particularly Harvard. Tom was a visiting professor here back in 2008 and 9, and once again 2012 to 2015, so he is very much zu Hause here at Harvard University and at the Center, and it's a great pleasure to host you today. Although having received the doctorate, I think barely 14 years ago, Tom has published 4 major books and countless articles. His first book, The Lodge Ghetto Album, won a 2004 Golden Light Award and a 2005 Infinity Award. And then his second book, Our Friend the Enemy, was the recipient of the 2008 Duke d'Arenberg History Prize for the best book of a general nature intended for the general public on the history and culture of the European continent. And then came his third book, Hitler's First War, very well-known book probably to many of you in the room, that is being translated into a total of 10 languages. The recipient of the 2010 Arthur Goodside Book Award of the New York Military Affairs Symposium for the best book in military history, and that is now being adapted into a fictionalized television series. I don't know if any of our fellows at the Center for European Studies have that distinction. And today, Tom will be speaking to us about his latest book, quite remarkable book, Becoming Hitler, The Making of a Nazi. It's being published this week by Basic Books, along with Oxford University Press. And most of the research for this book, I'm quite happy to say, was carried out here at the Center for European Studies and at the Weatherhead Center. So it's very nice to welcome you back to Harvard, Tom. We very much look forward to hearing about your book. You'll be speaking about the book for somewhere between 30 minutes, a bit longer, and then we will be able to open up the floor to questions and comments.
Thank you. Thank you, Derek, for this very kind introduction. Thank you so much for having me back to the Center for European Studies. I'm so delighted that I can speak about my book at the very place where I have researched and written most of the place. I should also say that people sometimes ask me when I tell them where I researched and wrote the book, and they say, they look a little bit in surprise at me, and I said, why didn't you spend 3 years, let's say, in Munich and research it there, and you would have been surrounded by all these experts and all these documents? And my response to them is, yes, that would be wonderful too, but that's precisely the point. I precisely wanted to research and write it at a place like here, where there may not be a lot of people working on Hitler, but where I would get the kind of inspiration that I thought I needed to write this book. So thank you for all your inspiration. So hang on, I just have got to figure out how to now use this thing. So Derek Penslar mentioned that I had written a book about Hitler before, and I thought I was kind of done with Hitler at that time. I had shown that the idea that had been dominant between the 1990s and, I suppose, the time I published my book, that it was really during the time of the First World War that Hitler had been radicalized. And I argued that Hitler returned from the war still being a man very much without a face. Someone who was still fluctuating political ideas, someone who was still an awkward loner, someone in whom no one had seen leadership qualities. But then, as I was talking about my book, people kept on saying, well, if you're right, how is it possible that this guy, this unremarkable guy, returns from the war, and yet, a year later, he is the man not pretty much the man whom we all know. And I realized at that point that I could kind of describe the problem, or I could lay out the parameters, but I couldn't really give an answer. And it was then that I was interested again and started to try to approach the enigma of how Hitler became Hitler. And I was really I was kind of troubled by the picture that at that point was emerging in research, where Hitler was the kind of guy that, sure, maybe had been radicalized during the war, but who then comes back from the war and who's then just full of vengeance and full of hatred and just soaks up all these ideas that are around him in Munich in general, and more specifically in the military in Munich during that time. And so Hitler is there presented as this kind of almost typical product of right-wing politics in Munich, and it's a picture of a Hitler who certainly had a talent soon as a speaker, but who beyond that was a man without too many qualities. And somehow that idea just didn't sound right to me. And so let's briefly talk about the parameters. So the story starts with Hitler returning from the war and returning to Munich, the city where he had settled in 1913 before the war. And so in a way, this is very much the story of the interaction between Hitler and Munich, between the end of the First World War and the writing of Mein Kampf. But as Hitler returns from the war, as other people start to be radicalized, in part, of course, as you will all know, Germany experienced, of course, a revolution at the end of the war, an overthrow of the old regime. And Munich, Bavaria, experienced a more radical revolution. While revolution had been led by moderates in Berlin, it was led by more radical left-wing leaders in Munich. It was at that point when people started to be radicalized, but not so Hitler, because Hitler returned from the war, and the expectation would have been that someone like him would just be demobilized, because most people, because of the armistice agreements, had to be demobilized at the end of the war, and so certainly someone who did not identify with the new regime would have been more likely than not, in the case of not professional soldiers, to just go home. But Hitler desperately wants to stay in the army. That's not necessarily a political statement, because Hitler really wants to try to escape loneliness. Hitler had really no family or friends to go home to. Sure, he did have 3 brothers and sisters, but he had long lost touch with them. They thought at that time he was dead. The support staff at regimental headquarters had been his surrogate family during the First World War. So now this guy returns to Bavaria and is very worried that he would kind of have to return to having no one. So he really is desperately trying to stay on in the army, and if that means serving the revolution, then so may be it. And Hitler stays on even as the revolution devours its own children. Here we see a photograph where, with a high degree of probability or certainty, we see Hitler involved here. This is the funeral march for Kurt Eisner, the Jewish socialist leader of the revolution. Hitler even stays on when in April a short-lived Munich Soviet Republic is being established. We don't know 100% what exactly his approach towards this regime was. My assumption is that Hitler generally had a moderate left-wing predisposition at that time, but he would not have positively identified with the Munich Soviet Republic, because of having been too internationalist. At the same time, he is even standing for office at that time. It is during the revolution that Hitler, for the first time ever, has a leadership position. It is then that, almost by accident, he detects that he can lead, because what is happening is as he time and time again runs the risk of being demobilized, that there is an opportunity to stand as a representative of the soldiers of his unit, and that he jumps at it because that decreases the risk of being demobilized. And then Hitler suddenly realized he can function, he can lead. Suddenly, so it's almost by trial by error that he starts to learn the art of leadership. But let's go back to kind of the political aspect of all this. So he certainly has, even if he does not positively identify himself with the ideals of the Munich Soviet Republic, he also at the same time has no problem serving it. Unlike some of his closest collaborators and friends, he does not leave Munich at that time in order to join a right-wing militia that puts down the Munich Soviet Republic, but he stays on. So this is still a guy who is certainly not radicalized in the way that we all know. My argument is that Hitler was politicized and radicalized in the summer of 1919, and the reason for that was the trigger, I should say, not the reason. The trigger was the ratification, the signing and the ratification of the Versailles Treaty. My argument here is quite different from the argument people sometimes make when they say, well, look, somehow the Versailles Treaty was too harsh, therefore there's a direct line between the two world wars. That's not my point. I don't even think that the Versailles Treaty was, certainly wasn't harsher than the peace that the Germans had imposed on the Russians the previous year. The real point about Versailles here is that, or the ratification of it, is it signifies to Hitler and so many other Germans that Germany really has lost the First World War. Because until then, a lot of Germans thought that the war had ended in some kind of draw, maybe one that wasn't particularly favorable to the Germans, but a draw nevertheless. And the belief was that the Americans and Wilson in Versailles, in Paris, would make sure that the Germans would get a just peace. So it's the total shock when in May the peace conditions are first being published, and then maybe more importantly, when people like Hitler realize the German government and Parliament they have no choice but to sign it and to ratify it. And as a result of that, Hitler, so this is kind of Hitler's political epiphany. He asked himself two questions. One is, how could Germany have lost the First World War? But maybe more importantly, because he doesn't just want to refight the last war, what would it take in order to recast Germany, in order to make Germany safe for all times? So what I'm really trying to do here is I'm trying to take Hitler seriously as a kind of man of ideas who is sincerely trying to understand the nature of things, who is genuinely trying to understand both the sources of defeat, but also how supposedly people were living in a rapidly changing world, one that would, as we would say today, would see the emergence of a small number of superpowers, and that Hitler was honestly trying to figure out what it would take to recast Germany. So in that sense, I'm trying to present kind of Hitler as a man of ideas. This is obviously not to say that that it's a rational view. Obviously, it's based on irrational first principles, but he puts them together once you accept these irrational first principles, he kind of puts them together in a way that there has some kind of inner coherence, and he very honestly and sincerely tries to engage with ideas. This is a man who every day of his life, at the end of the day, even late at night, is reading books. People often say, well, he didn't really read them properly, he didn't read them from cover to cover. Sure. That's all true, and yet it remains true that he felt an urge to engage with these books, with these newspapers on a daily basis. At any rate, so my argument is that as a result of these two questions, he becomes really someone who is searching for answers. He is someone who is trying to figure out what it would take to recast Germany. And he comes up with two answers as to his two questions. The first one is that the primary source of Germany's domestic weakness is the influence of the Jews, and the primary source of Germany's external weakness is insufficient territory, insufficient manpower, and insufficient resources. And those two questions and those two answers provide the guiding principles of his life until the day he dies in 1945. And his anti-Semitism, I talk a little bit more about the quality about this a little bit later, but what I want to briefly mention at this point, the anti-Semitism he uses is, while not original, it's different from the most popular brand of anti-Semitism in Munich at that time. The most popular brand is anti-Bolshevik anti-Semitism as a result of this idea that the Munich Soviet Republic was all just a Jewish endeavor. But Hitler doesn't really care about that, at least not at this point. Later he does. As Hitler is trying to figure out the architecture of the world, the hidden architecture of the world, he's exposed to ideas from which he kind of picks selectively, like from a buffet of ideas. And one of the ideas that really kind of makes sense to him is the harmful influence of Jewish ideas. He's really obsessed with, I guess, ideas of political economy and of finance. So he thinks that it is these Jewish ideas that are corrupting Germany, that are leading to inequality Germany, that are holding Germany back, and that ultimately prevent Germany from surviving in this internal competition of who will emerge as one of those superpowers. Hitler believes that one of these superpowers will be the Anglo-American world. And ultimately, what Hitler really wants is he wants to make sure that Germany will be put on equal footing with the Anglo-American world. And for that to happen, he thinks Judaism, Jewish ideas, really have to be fully purged from Germany. Otherwise, Germany will not survive. But interestingly, initially, he does not. Initially, he did not think that Germany on its own could survive and be one of those superpowers. But we'll come back to that in a minute. What I first really want to talk about a little bit, first of all, why I think that this idea of that Hitler was just this typical product of right-wing politics in Munich doesn't quite work. Here we see on the right this kind of short man. He is the guy who kind of let the genie out of the bottle. He's a guy called Karl Mayr, Hitler's commanding officer in the propaganda unit in post-revolutionary Munich. And we often hear that Hitler was really just exposed to his ideas and the ideas that were floating around. But as I'm trying to show in the book is that these propaganda units were surprisingly politically heterogeneous. Of course, not all political ideas were represented in them, but a great variety of different ideas were represented in them, and Hitler picks from them selectively. Another reason why I think that this idea that he's just suddenly has found a new home, both literally and metaphorically, in the post-revolutionary army is this guy. This guy is a guy called Michael Keogh, or I don't really know how to pronounce the Irish names, but he's an Irish volunteer in the German forces. He had been a POW in Germany during the First World War and had then joined an Irish brigade that then was dissolved, but he stayed on. And in 1919, when he was in the Bavarian Reichswehr, he rescued Hitler from being beaten up when speaking to soldiers as a propagandist in the summer of 1919. So clearly, he was not just talking to like-minded people. Another reason why I think this idea doesn't quite work is his talk at Camp Lechfeld. We often read that Hitler is being sent there late in the summer because there is a report about his anti-Semitic speech we give here. It's mentioned everywhere because this is the first known anti-Semitic statement by Hitler. And for that, it certainly is of significance. But this idea that he now there talks to returning POWs who are in this camp, German soldiers who return from having been POWs abroad, and that this is huge success doesn't work, because because the commander of the camp decides, as the propaganda unit, including Hitler, arrive from Munich, is that he just doesn't trust them. He just thinks that Hitler and his peers can't be let anywhere near these returning POWs. So he basically just has Hitler talk to the guards of the camp, and from them he gets a positive response. So Hitler is still a man who's very much searching for a new home, a man who's searching for political answers to these two big questions. Initially, as he is searching for a new home, he actually tries to join a different party, the German Socialist Party, but they turn him down. And it is really only in the late summer when he's being sent to observe the meeting of the nascent Nazi Party in this back room. And with this is a very small group. I mean, probably the same kind of number that are in this place now. So this party is kind of a misnomer there. So this meeting in this back room, and he's supposed to just kind of observe the meeting. But what then happens is that halfway through the meeting, someone gets up and basically makes a case for Bavarian separatism, for Bavarian independence. And Hitler is so incensed by this that he just jumps up, he starts to lay into this guy, and the people are just enthralled how he has got a go at him. The guy, halfway through Hitler having a go at him, just leaves the place, and people just cheering at him. Hitler finally, again, almost by accident, has found a place that provides him both with a kind of with a home, a place to fit in, but also it provides him with a political home. Because even during the First World War, when Hitler had been kind of searching, when he may have been seen as an awkward loner, even by people who liked him, even at that time he had talked constantly about international affairs and so on. It's just that no one had taken him seriously. But now suddenly people were really connecting with him. Suddenly Hitler had found a home. And another reason why this kind of searching of a new home is so important is can be shown to the case of the German girl from New York, Helene Hamstengel. You may be more familiar with her husband, Pucci Hamstengel, who of course attended Harvard, who became Hitler's foreign press chief, and because he had an extraordinary talent later when he was back in America and had broken with Hitler, of writing books in which everyone but he himself would look bad. And but in a way, as we look at kind of the papers of Helene Hamstengel, we realize Helene Hamstengel was far more important for Hitler, because again, Hitler was really searching for a place to fit in. He was for about a year and a half, he went to her apartment every day, and they would sit down together. They would have meals. They would talk. He would play with their son. So Hitler is a strange guy who, on the one hand, can't really keep up contact with his family, who can't keep up contacts over many years, who can't have relationship with people on a kind of a horizontal fashion, and yet who constantly tries to find a home, tries to find people to intermingle with. But as time is racing, I want to move on to talk about Hitler as a political operator, because the view that we're normally presented with about Hitler during this time is this is a guy who's full of vengeance, who maybe knows how to give a good speech, but who other than that has no idea about the nature of politics, who also has no design yet to become a leader, who thinks that he's a drummer for someone else. And what I'm trying to show in the book, that view is really quite wrong. Hitler very cleverly, so Hitler quickly really picks up what maybe instinctively, maybe through systematic studying the nature of political life and observing other people, and he quickly figures out how he can play the system, how he can create a system for himself. He pays lip service to this idea of being the drummer for someone else, all the while creating a narrative and an expectation for a totally new kind of leader. And at that time, there was this longing in Germany for geniuses to emerge to lead Germany out of misery. I'll tell you in a minute what a genius is according to the definition of the time. The idea here was across political party lines that the old elites, whether they were left-wing or right-wing, clearly had messed things up. What it would need would be the emergence of a genius. A genius was someone without any pedigree, without someone who was not an aristocrat, someone who had not been to some fancy college or university, someone who came literally out of nowhere, who had innate qualities to understand the nature of things. This is also why Mein Kampf is so important, that it's told as an autobiography, as the story of the boy of Brauner von Im, who while growing up in a kind of way of a Bildungsroman, has all these revelations about the hidden architecture of the world, which he then can apply to lead Germany out of misery. And Hitler kind of, in a political sense, in a brilliant way, creates this expectation of this new kind of leadership. The only problem is that Hitler kind of had miscalculated the time he would have to establish himself, because in 1923 he suddenly realizes there's a widespread expectation for a political overthrow. There is there's a communist attempt to start revolution in Germany, based on orders received from Russia, but there's also various right-wing attempts underfoot to overthrow the political system, particularly so in Bavaria. And in Bavaria, this is a kind of an unholy alliance of Bavarian separatists who basically ultimately just want to exploit the situation to bring sovereignty back to Bavaria, in the same way that had been true before the First World War, to be finally masters in their own home again, in their own house again. And of German right-wing nationalists. And it is onto these kind of movements that Hitler latches onto, pretending to be just the drummer for them, all the while creating this expectation of this new kind of leadership. But what Hitler had realized in the summer of 1923 was that at this point he really only had been a celebrity in Munich and in Bavaria. People in the rest of Germany started to talk about him, but ultimately they didn't even know what he looked like, because at that time Hitler did not allow himself to be photographed, and he had not talked about his own life. And so Hitler quickly realized that he had a real problem. And if you want to be a national leader, people better know what you look like. Here we see a page from a German satirical magazine where people were making fun of the fact that anyone knew what Hitler looked like. This is a photo spread to say, what does Hitler really look like? But so Hitler reversed this Bilderverbot and had a propaganda postcard being printed, circulated them in tens of thousands of copies, and fascinatingly so, also wrote his first autobiography, a very short autobiography. It's just really the introduction to this collection of speeches being published in the late summer of 1923. What Hitler did again was he wrote this piece where he ultimately presents himself as this genius, as this German messiah. He specifically compares himself to Jesus. Of course, it doesn't look very good to if you say yourself, I'm the messiah. So what he does is he finds someone else who the guy on the right, who agrees to give his name to this autobiography, which then is published as a biography by this right-wing conservative writer, Victor von Körber. And so he does that in order to, again, to establish himself on a national stage, and of remaking the case that it is he who could fill the gap that he had prior to that established. So we really see here a very skillful and conniving political operator. And so let me just jump. Let me skip talking about the putsch in 1923, because I realize I don't have that much time left, and briefly talk about so after the failed putsch in 1923, Hitler in a way is facing total disaster, because the putsch had been premature. And the problem was even that people did not associate him with the putsch. Ludendorff, the First World War general with whom he carried this out, was the person who got all the credit. Newspapers in Germany referred to the Ludendorff putsch. And Hitler first was also trying in the trial not to. Sorry, what I should have said is what's then happening is in the trial, everyone is trying to blame Hitler. Also, all these German Bavarian conservatives and so on. So, well, nothing to do with us, was all Hitler. First, which was totally untrue. And first, Hitler is also trying to defend himself against that. But then he suddenly realizes, hang on. This is actually a great moment. This is here's a national stage for me, and it's great if everyone blames me for something I haven't done, because now suddenly I can present myself as the German messiah, as the German national leader. So within a few weeks, the Ludendorff putsch and the Ludendorff trial turns into the Hitler putsch and the Hitler trial. And it is then, of course, while in Landsberg, that he writes this kind of Bildungsroman where he tells the story about the boy from Braunau who comes to save Germany. What I want to talk about over the last few minutes is a little bit about the emergence of Hitler's political ideas. Again, I think here we see a picture that will hopefully look familiar to at least everyone at Center for European Studies, which is, of course, from the other end of this building. This is from the murals at the other end of the building, done in the 1930s by, I've just forgot the first name. Louis Rubinstein, and it's supposed to, and it's basically it's an anti-Nazi mural, and this dwarf Alberich from Wagner is supposed to be Hitler. So Hitler is being presented here as a kind of spiteful dwarf. Again, this guy full of vengeance. But I think it's ultimately a view that doesn't quite work. This is a guy who was serious about ideas, and whose ideas still continued to evolve. One of the fascinating stories from her book, at least fascinating for me, is the story of Hitler's secret Russian collusion. Here we see Hitler in the autumn of 1923, together with the wife of one of the pretenders to the vacant Russian throne. And in fact, Hitler closely collaborated with her husband in the early 1920s, as well as with her, as well as with other Russian emigres in Munich. The story is often told here of Baltic Germans and their influence. Yes, these Baltic Germans are important too, but they're primarily important because they build up these contacts. What I think is far more important ultimately is the connection with these guys, because this brings us back to the question of how could Germany be put on equal footing with the Anglo-American world in this rapidly changing world. And Hitler just initially thinks Germany on its own is just not big enough. So he thinks that it would take a permanent and all-encompassing alliance with a restored Tsarist Russia in order to be on equal footing with the Anglo-American world. This is what it would require for Germany to survive. And the reason why I think this is so revealing is because it reveals also the nature of Hitler's racism, and as well as his anti-Semitism. The point here is that often Hitler's drive to the East, Hitler's colonialism, Hitler's grabbing of territory in the East is being presented as resulting from Hitler's racism. But I think it's the other way around. It's ultimately a function of it. It's ultimately a post-ex facto justification for it. Because when Hitler realizes in 1924 in Landsberg that the Soviet Union is there to stay, Lenin is dead, but the regime is still there. At that point, Hitler decides, well, I suppose then if we can't have this alliance with them, then we have got to defeat them. We have got to grab their territories. We have to colonize them. And so Hitler almost literally overnight, therefore, turns Russians, turns Slavs into subhumans. Hitler really had no problems with Russians and Slavs until that moment in time. Hitler's racism really had been a kind of dualist racism between Germans or Europeans and Jews. And it is here for, I guess, ultimately political expediency or opportunism that the nature of his racism totally changes. And in a way, it's tragic if we think about how many tens of millions of Slavs, including civilians, were being killed by Hitler, how this anti-Slavic racism came into existence. But I think this also sheds light onto the on the emergence of Hitler's anti-Semitism, because the racism against Jews had been there from the beginning, and it really was a constant. I do argue that there is a possibility that initially his anti-Semitism, for the first year or so after his anti-Semitic conversion, might possibly have been almost metaphorical in character. This was ultimately more about Jewish ideas than Jewish bodies. We have to bear in mind that, for instance, one of the primary influences on Hitler is Houston Stewart Chamberlain. He would, for instance, say privately, not every Jew is a Jew, and you can be a Jew without being a Jew. So he's ultimately saying, yes, we're using the language of racial anti-Semitism, but ultimately this is really about ideas. And it's possible that for the first year or so of his anti-Semitism, Hitler may have seen this in similar veins. But I think then things really change. And I think Hitler's radicalization of his anti-Semitism is different from the radicalization of some of his other ideas. Because some of his other ideas radicalize in almost as a result of how he gives his speeches and his Nazism. He feeds off audiences in speeches. He looks to where he gets the biggest applause or the biggest response, and then the next time really focuses on that and downplays other aspects. This is both, I think, because of his Nazism, but it's also because Hitler is trying to distinguish himself and the nascent Nazi party in the busy marketplace that right-wing politics is in Munich. And I think this leads to a cycle of radicalization. But I think in anti-Semitism, the case is different. And the reason why I think we know this is, well, not only because of what we can infer from this kind of Russian collusion, but also because Hitler in private talks more radically about the Jews than in public. He, of course, already talks extremely radical in public, but in private, he is even more radical. I already present two examples in the book. Since then, I have realized that there's at least two more examples where we're kind of out of time. I can maybe talk more about this in the Q&A if you're interested, but he's ultimately saying privately that if it was up to him, he would really prefer to kill the Jews. I would argue that at least from 1920 or 21 onwards, there is a preferred final solution for Hitler that is genocidal. He is saying privately, it would really be the best thing that we can do is to kill all the Jews. And he comes up with this kind of, he describes this in gory detail. Happy to expand on this later if you want to. But he does, crucially, he does not do so in public. therefore, actually, I do argue in the book that the road to Auschwitz may have been long, but it was arguably less twisted than people often argue. You may say, well, yes, but isn't the problem here that, for instance, in the peacetime years of the Third Reich, Hitler is perfectly happy to accept Jewish immigration from Germany? That is true, but I think it's easy to square the circle here, because what Hitler says in one of those 4 cases, he basically says the best thing would be to kill all the Jews, but it's not possible. I've looked at it from all sides, but it's just not possible. So what he's saying there is he has a preferred final solution, because that would be the best way to make sure that the primary source of Germany's domestic weakness is being removed, that Germany can be one of those superpowers, but if it's not possible, then he's willing to accept second or third best final solutions, which would include emigration from Germany. But I think what it also means that if the situation ever arises that that genocide would become possible, whether anticipated by Hitler or not, would mean that at that moment Hitler would jump at it. And I also do think that there are reasons to believe that in 1940, 1941, as the final solution emerges, that Hitler is a more central figure than he's often presented as. So I think there is a far more direct line. I'm not trying to make a return to the kind of accrued version of intentionalism, where Hitler is just sort of like he's planning everything out and then just deviously planning step by step. That's not my point. But my point is that he has a preferred final solution. He would, if the situation comes up, he would jump at it. I think there's also a developmental logic in his policies that he may or may not have realized himself that is genocidal. And also, and this is my final point on this, this idea that ultimately the killing process in 1941 starts with initiatives from below and is then just condoned by Hitler, underestimates the extent to which Hitler had set up the system in the first place, where the only policy challenge, or the only credible solution to the policy challenge that these guys have on the ground as a result of the orders that Hitler had given was genocidal. I would be happy to elaborate that, but I'm really out of time. So therefore, I look forward to your questions.
Thank you for this wonderful overview of the book. Since I'm up here, I'm actually going to, I'm afraid once the questions start, I won't get a word in. So I'm going to ask the first question. I mean, one thing has to do with, in some ways, it sounds like your book deals with the issue of what today is called radicalization, and how rapidly, really exponentially, it can occur. That people who are operating in one universe that we consider to be normal, how quickly they change. And of course, usually we assume that there is something, there are predisposing factors. These things don't come from nowhere. And for him to have gone from 0 to 60 in 5 seconds, right? If you could reflect a little bit more on these predisposing factors. Also a little bit about his family. I mean, it's perfectly normal. People do often abandon their blood family and seek surrogate families. That's actually very common. But again, is there a specific reason in terms of family trauma or family dysfunction? Because sometimes when people actually behave this way, when they're leaving a family and seeking a surrogate family, it's often a suggestion of or an indication of some kind of deep dysfunction. I know that you're trying to argue not on a psychological level, but you're interacting him, placing him into a specific context in which he is able to transform himself very quickly. Specifically, the context of 2 forms, really. I saw the connection between Versailles and the survival of the Soviet Union in the wake of Lenin's death, that he simply cannot deal with the destruction of wishful thinking. That on the one hand, Germany lost the war, but they didn't lose the war. And Versailles drives home to him that, in fact, they did lose the war. And this seems to have a traumatizing effect on him. Just as the fact that the Soviet Union, it turns out that he's convinced himself it's not going to survive, and then it does. Again, there's something, I don't want to distract you too much from the more contextual to the essential, but there's something very odd going on in a man for whom it is so difficult to live with the frustration of desire, to live with disappointment. This is not a normal reaction to disappointment. Anyway, react briefly to those, and then I'll throw it open to the floor.
Thank you for those great questions. And in a way, you have kind of immediately zeroed in on the kind of issues where I kind of feel frustrated that I don't have a better training in psychology and psychiatry, and in order to be able to kind of fully make sense of the kind of questions that you have been asking. I mean, this frustration of desire, I mean, I never kind of quite conceptualized this way, but I think that's a great way of putting it. But let's look at these questions in order. Predispositioning features or factors. Yes, I think that plays a role. I think there's a lot of things that certainly start to at least be dormant in Hitler during the First World War, where he may not have quite have necessarily settled on particular answers, but where he would have been exposed to them, and would have also been searching for them, would have been searching for answers. We do know that even at that time he had been deeply interested in politics. So I think in that sense, it's not like suddenly that this is kind of empty slate, who suddenly now in 1919 is being kind of exposed to all these ideas and has got this crash course, but he has got all these kind of building elements in his head, which not necessarily had been quite put together yet, but which now can easily put together. I think it's also in that context that we do need to talk about both his childhood and his time in Vienna. I think ultimately, Brigitte Haman's idea that he wasn't radicalized in Vienna yet, or his idea that he had all these Jewish friends, is absolutely correct. But that is not to say that he hadn't been exposed to these ideas, that he had not been exposed to ways of thinking about the world through this. I think also generally ideas of political economy, inequality, all those kind of issues that he's then really kind of focusing in 1919 were discussions that he would have been exposed to in Vienna. I think we also need to. There are political constants or continuities from his childhood or adolescence. One of them is his pan-German ideas, pan-German in a kind of non-party line. This kind of really idea of wanting to bring all Germans together under one roof. That plays a role. Also, this kind of rejection of internationalism that is, for instance, comes up in one of these First World War letters. I think it's misunderstood generally as a specific rejection of social democracy, which I don't think it is. But I think it is using the language of today, it's a sentiment of anti-globalism that had been emerging with Hitler, that already was with Hitler during the war, which he had not fully categorized yet. But I think ultimately his ways of thinking of political economy, his ways of then zeroing in on Jews in 1919 is a continuation of this struggling with what we would call today globalism. And the last thing I want to say is it's something I just sort of briefly allude to in the book, because if I spoke about this more explicitly, people would rightly kill me. Is the impact of Hitler's missing year? We don't really know what happened to Hitler between 1912 and 1913. I think there are good reasons to believe that something very traumatic did happen during that time. But it's difficult, of course, now to kind of speculate on how this was interacted with all these other factors if we don't know exactly what it is that was traumatic during that time. In terms of his family, yes, a lot of people have dysfunctional families, and and rather together with friends. But with him, things go much further than that. I mean, when he first actually does show up on the doorstep of his sister a couple of years after the war in Vienna and just knocks on her door, she's totally perplexed because she thought her brother had died several years ago. And the only time there is a reunion, I mean, he has some contact with her, some contact, of course, with his half-sister, because, of course, he fancies his niece. But the only reunion of the entire surviving Hitler family happens, I think, in 1927 or 1928 during the party rally. And they all think, like, great, finally we're together. And then they all show up in Nuremberg. They meet up with Hitler, and all Hitler does is to say, well, I got you together because I want to tell you that you should not exploit your name. And you should not take any advantage of being a Hitler. And then he dismisses them. And they never have a reunion again. I wished I could really answer your question. I wished I really knew what the source of this family dysfunction was. As you know, I have been talking quite a bit with Nasir Gami in Boston, a psychiatrist who works on bipolarity. I think
first-rate madness.
Exactly. Yeah. I think his argument that Hitler was suffering from bipolar disorder is plausible. Whether it's true, I don't know, but it is plausible. And I think it may, to some extent, explain certain kind of difficulties of relationships, but it would still not explain quite a dysfunctionality of the family. And if you have an answer to it, I would love to hear it.
The only problem with his work is that everybody is bipolar.
Yes, it's a bit like that, true.
Yeah. Every political leader is bipolar. Maybe they all are. And I don't want to monopolize. I mean, there's lots of people who have questions. So I'm going to start in the back and sort of work my way forward. There's a gentleman way in the back.
Thank you. First of all, you put some emphasis on his ideas, and you describe a transition from a kind of momentary flirtation with left ideas, if I heard you correctly, and then a kind of almost, you use the word suddenly, he's in a very right-wing milieu. So could you speak a little bit, can you elaborate on the nature of that transition, how it shows up in the ideas that you put emphasis on? And then the other thing is, not only sort of this idea that he came out of nowhere, but he had, it seems, some help, some assistance in moving through this transition to a place of preeminence. And other, different historians have written about that in different ways. Neumann, for example. What do you have to say about the forces that enabled Hitler, that supported Hitler's rise? And, you put a lot of emphasis just sort of in the biographical story, but what about the sort of context? How you see the importance of those elements, did they play an important role in placing him in a position where he was needed?
As with regards to the first question about the left-wing and right-wing bit, I think this kind of move from left to right becomes, in a way, far easier to explain if we actually stop using those terms. One of my colleagues in Aberdeen was kind of suggesting, but it was too difficult, whether I could write these revolution chapters without using the word left-wing or right-wing ever, where we're really just trying to say what I really mean with that. And if we look at what Hitler really, I suppose, at this, the kind of ideas that are attractive to him, they're ultimately collectivist, they're not internationalist, they're national, but we also have to bear in mind, of course, that certainly National Bolshevists in post-First World War Germany had these non-internationalist views. Even moderate mainstream social democrats had this kind of embrace of the nation, and this kind of I think basically ideas that are collectivist, that embrace the nation, and that are ultimately anti-globalist are attractive to him. And if we look at it from this perspective, I think it becomes far less surprising that he is flirting with different political ideas on the left and the right. And it also immediately explains why Hitler is not an empty political slate. A liberal party would have just been inconceivable that they would have been attractive for him. Even a traditional conservative party would have been difficult to see how they would have been provided a home. And certainly a radical left-wing internationalist party also wouldn't fit the mold. But the wider influence, in a way, I would love to talk about it, but I feel I would have got to give like a 3-hour lecture, but I'll try to do it in 2 sentences, is it's difficult not to do it in a biographical sense because it is linked to influence of particular people. It is linked to the influence of, for instance, of his paternal mentor, Dietrich Eckart. It is linked to other key influences during this time. But in a way, I could almost link this questions to your first question about how he kind of moves between these different ideas. I think it's basically generally the political ideas that are floating around in interwar Germany about political economy, about collectivism, about the space of about the nation, and about geopolitics, to which Hitler is being attracted. And Hitler is kind of particularly attracted to people who have kind of an overall view, the kind of people like Houston Stuart Chamberlain and his famous book, The Foundations of the 19th Century, this kind of all-encompassing ways of trying to make sense to the world. I know that I'm not doing justice to your question, but email me and I'll give you a longer answer.
In front, yes.
Yes. This is a lot of information that is really appreciated because it needs to be looked at quite often, because there are implications in dealing with across history and present times. This kind of thinking is important to understand. I wonder if you could clarify something for me that I've heard that I've seen his paintings. I think they're quite remarkably good, and yet it's been said that he was told how terrible his paintings were, and this could do a number on someone's psyche, and I'm wondering how much this could have been part of this picture of maybe his break with the Jewish community. I don't know where he was painting. I don't know who told him that his paintings were terrible. But I also wonder, in combination with that, was he looking to say to certain European countries, look, people, I'm for your views about Jews, and therefore you recognize me, Hitler, as someone who's part of your community, therefore pat me on the back and help me accomplish. So I throw that out, and I could sure use your insights.
It's a difficult question to answer because his rejection as an artist clearly was very important for the making of it, and not just because of the obvious counterfactuals that you could connect with him. I mean, this goes back to issues that also earlier Derek Penzler had raised about how he deals with rejection, how he deals with the kind of collapse of dreams. And he's obviously not very good with that. Hitler is generally someone who holds grudge against people for the rest of his lives. I mean, part of the reason why, for instance, Hitler doesn't really embrace this kind of beyond paying lip service, these kind of Nordic ideas, or even like donors who desperately want to support him, he happily kind of accepts their money, but doesn't really want to hang out with them because he all associates them with the party wing that initially in 1919 was slighting him, was trying to cut him out. You would think, like, a couple of years later, who cares if they all want to support you? Why don't you just go along with that? But he doesn't. He kind of grudgingly pays lip service to because he knows he needs their support, but he just can't let go. He just can't deal with that kind of rejection. The same is true with the rejection from that small party that I mentioned earlier. The real reason why this matters is because it kind of explains why Hitler is so desperately trying to prevent in 2022 and 2023 the merger with this party and another party, which all the other Nazi leaders want, and he just sort of like puts up a stink, and in Kershaw describes him there as a prima donna who just throws fits. But he is not just a prima donna who's throwing fits. He's doing this because, well, I guess maybe to some extent he is, because ultimately this all goes back to this slight against him of this kind of rejection. But the problem is, as with regards to being turned down in art school, but maybe also for his art not being appreciated, we don't have enough information about who exactly was slighting him there. There's not some case where some famous Jewish collector said, look, your art is just a joke or something like that. Could have happened, sure, but we just don't know. So in that sense, it's I'm afraid I probably can't quite answer that question. There certainly have been suggestions that that there was rejections from particular Jews at a traumatic period of his life that would have contributed to it. I don't want to think that it would explain everything, because ultimately I think he precisely thinks he has got this all-encompassing way that you really have got to solve the problem once and for all. But whether those kind of experiences from the past, this kind of being slighted in the past, may explain why in 1919 he is picking from this kind of rich buffet of ideas the anti-Semitic one rather than a different one, I don't know.
Yeah, so Tom, I enjoyed the presentation. Very early on, you had this picture up where this, it was I guess it was the 1919 Revolution of Munich, where you said this might be Hitler, and you said my assumption is.
What did I do
you
now?
used the word assumption. My assumption is that he was kind of embedded in this leftist milieu and so on. So I was just wondering. That's a strange thing to assume. So there must be evidence supporting that position. So I'm just wondering what's the main evidence on this, that he was part of this left? I mean, although you said not to use these terms, but I think,
No, sure.
Yeah.
The big frustration about Hitler's time during the revolution is that the surviving evidence is so fragmentary, because Hitler very diligently destroyed any evidence that he could. And in Mein Kampf, where he's not exactly brief about his own life, he just rushes through the revolution. What he says about his own experience of the revolution would literally fit on the back of an envelope, which of course is telling in and of itself, but doesn't answer the question. So the surviving pieces of evidence are fragmentary, and they're often based on later recollections. And the question now is how we align those pieces of fragmentary evidence. For instance, with this piece of a photograph, with this photograph, the problem is, of course, how do we know that this is Hitler? I mean, we could also ask, if this is Hitler, what exactly does it mean that he is there? But let's not even go there. Let's say, is this Hitler? And it's difficult to say. I mean, it's someone who looks like Hitler, but he's also blurry. So clearly there were a lot of other soldiers who were roughly that size and had a mustache, and who, once they're grainy, would look like Hitler. The evidence in this particular case is based on the son of the photographer saying in the 70s, I believe, this is Hitler. Whether the guy really wanted, whether now the son, but now how do we know that the son first of all, how do we know that the Sun was not trying to make this more important than it is? And second of all, how do we know that even if he honestly thinks that this is Hitler, what would be his piece of information? And so you could say, well, then we should maybe just dismiss this particular photograph in total. But if we take that approach, we would inevitably have got to dismiss all pieces of evidence, because ultimately all pieces of evidence relating to Hitler's period in the revolution are iffy. There's photographs where it could or could not be Hitler. They are recollections of people from later on where we don't know exactly whether they're true. There's stuff from Konrad Heiden's account in the 1930s where, because he was protecting his sources while in emigration, he wasn't fully disclosing them. So it's difficult, again, to verify or falsify them. And so if we take all of that out, all we would know is, from some documentary evidence, that he was serving in this unit and that he was standing for office. And also, for instance, I think we could still even do quite a bit with that. Because, for instance, when he was standing for office, now, of course, we don't know, does that mean he is the spokesperson, it sometimes is argued, of all the people who were kind of secretly standing against the regime or who were right-wing? But what I did, for instance, in this context, is I looked at election results in the Bavarian elections for those soldiers, because at that time there had been special polling officers for soldiers that are still in the army. So you can look up what the unit that voted for Hitler, how they voted in the election. And I forgot the exact figures off the top of my head, but I think about 80% vote for moderate or radical left-wing parties. So in that sense, it would be inconceivable that they would have voted for Hitler if they all thought that Hitler was really secretly right-wing. So it's really a combination of all these kind of pieces of evidence and putting them together where I think a picture emerges where there is a high probability that Hitler, in fact, at the very least, he served them, but that he also, at that point, would have at least been seen by others as having a moderately left-wing predisposition. But this is ultimately a question about probability and plausibility, which is very frustrating.
I have three names. I've got you two down, and I've got Jamie. And
okay, I'll try to be faster in my answers.
And then just one second. So Jamie, and I've got everyone down. But yes,
okay,
Jamie.
Thanks, Tom. This was really interesting. Gave me a lot to think about. I guess I have a question. If you could, I really liked what you just did in response to Daniel's question to kind of walk us through the evidence. Except I have a question that kind of relates to what Derek brought up earlier, which was, I'm curious as to why you put the radicalization, which happens very rapidly in the summer of 1919, around the Treaty of Versailles. Why was it not related to the Soviet Republic, the Reichswehr Soldaten marching around Bavaria at the same time in April and May? Why do you see it as the Treaty of Versailles as kind of the catalyst for this radicalization to happen so fast? Mm-hmm. German politicians, the government resigns, right, when the treaty is presented. It's in May, I think, of 1919. Sure. But why do you have this radical flip? And then kind of in a different vein, but something I was also thinking about. I'm interested in the idea of Hitler as a man of ideas, but you depict him as a man of ideas, almost, at least what you presented today, is a man of ideas whose ideas get frozen when he writes Mein Kampf. And it doesn't seem to evolve past that, at least in what you've talked about today. And I was curious, you argue the genocidal roots are there early. All these things that we see in Hitler are there very early. Can you talk about things that you do think, if Hitler really is a man of ideas, his ideas must have also changed later in the 1920s and 1930s, and can you talk about things that did change, where you see him interacting with other things, like go beyond your book? And
How unfair a question. Sure, I'll answer that question. As with regards to the question of the why Versailles, you are absolutely right to answer that question, because in a way this is a similar. In a way, it is very similar to Daniel's questions about the revolution. The evidence is almost more fragmentary for the summer of 1919. This is in part based on. I've got to say that I don't forget any of my kind of bodies of the pieces of evidence or of my argument. This is in part based on timing, on ideas that he subsequently uses. I think and I'll get back to that in a second, if this was a rejection of Bolshevism and of the experience of the Soviet Republic, we would expect that his first political statements from the late summer would focus upon those. But if we, for instance, look at the Gemlich letter, so the first anti-Semitic letter, which is this kind of 3 or 4 page letter from September of 1919, the focus is not on Bolshevism at all, but is on Jewish capitalism. So there is, the same is true for what's happening in Lechfeld. There is also this is also based on subsequent testimony of people who say that during this time Hitler talked non-stop about the Versailles Treaty. He would not do anything other than reading the peace conditions all day long. It's based on the fact that I believe, I would have got to check, go back to my sources. I think not his first speech, but the first written piece that he writes, or substantial piece, is this flyer where he compares this propaganda flyer where he compares the piece of Brest-Litovsk with the piece of Versailles, and everyone just says this is his one topic. This is what he was really focusing upon. So it's I wish there was some kind of document where someone says on July 10th I sat together with Hitler in the pub and we talked about this and that, and then suddenly Hitler had got this eureka moment and this all happens. I don't. This is ultimately based on putting together these pieces of evidence that I have mentioned a minute ago. I'm sure I've forgotten something, but that's kind of how I put together my argument in this particular context. You've asked an excellent question about the evolution of his ideas. Why is it that they seem to be frozen once he has written Mein Kampf? I'm not entirely sure whether I have a perfect answer, so I may get back to you on that, but I will still try to answer your question now. I think he's certainly very much searching for ideas ever since 1919. We can also see how his ideas are evolving at that time. I pointed out to you earlier that there were actually a lot of ideas where he would, for anything that's maybe not about Judaism or the general idea of this generally geopolitical ideas, if things are in flux. He seems to settle down a little bit in Mein Kampf. I think it's in part that he often describes his time in Landsberg as his university. I think that he was then really trying to figure out how things fit together. And I think part he also felt that he couldn't really quite publicly move on from that. But then as the more I talk about it now and give you the answer, while giving the answer I realize that his ideas kind of do continue, because if you compare Hitler as Mein Kampf and Hitler's unpublished second book from 1928, we do see a change in how he speaks the Anglo-American world. We do also, if we look at, it's quite fascinating to look at the surviving copies of Hitler's library in the Library of Congress. Not a lot of books have annotations, but some of them do. And from that, we can see that he was really still, even later on, engaging with ideas of whether ultimately Germany should be a republic or a monarchy, what kind of monarchy, and so on. So I think he clearly is still engaging with ideas. So I think it's not that this guy is basically then now just laying back in 1925 and say, now I'm no longer searching. I think he does continue to search, but he is not. I guess to some extent in the second book he is breaking with some of stuff from Mein Kampf, but with his other stuff he continues to search, for instance, on what exactly the state should be that is being set up. But then again, he doesn't really talk about this publicly, and I'm not entirely sure why.
The gentleman in the back, you've had your hand up for a while.
Hitler may have actually been quite prescient about the emerging world order and the importance of Russia. Even today, Anglo-American planners are very worried about a closer alliance between Germany and Russia as an alternative seat of power. But you seem to be giving kind of short shrift to his views on Slavs in a racial perspective. But couldn't Hitler have made much better use of opposition to Stalin when he started edging closer to invading the Soviet Union, and when he got into Ukraine? Did he really find it necessary to fully conquer Russia? Is bring them as part of his empire plans to create a greater alternative to the other power centers that he saw in the world? Couldn't he have handled Russia better if he had no real racial animus towards them?
That's a great question. And in fact, I have been thinking about, in the light of the stuff that I've been writing, I've been talking about, for instance, what do we make of the Hitler-Stalin Pact? We generally see it as only tactical, and I still are tempted to think it's only tactical. But sometimes I wonder, or maybe is this a return of trying to think, well, is there maybe an alternative way of creating, of making Germany strong enough without the need of totally invading them? He may well be searching for this, but I think he ultimately is also is seeing that maybe there can be kind of division of sphere of influences, but there will certainly not be an all-encompassing alliance with Stalinist Russia. And I would also imagine that at this point, that Hitler's anti-Bolshevism and quite possibly also his anti-Slavic racism has really been solidified, and Hitler has started to believe in that. I mean, of course, one of the big questions often is are there moments in Hitler's life where he initially only says something for tactical reasons, but ultimately started to believe his own lies? And I suppose with regards to Russia, it's a little bit unclear on what's happening there in the second half of the 1930s.
Yes.
You mentioned that the moment that galvanized Hitler's discovery of his oratorical talents was a response to a speech about Bavarian separatism. I wonder why you think that was the issue that caused him to erupt in this way. There were many other things in the milieu of that time that might have caused him to react and discover his gifts. What was the nature of that issue? Did it have something to do with nascent thoughts about the viable political unit? And was that political unit the nation or the German people from which he did not want to see Bavaria split off? Why Bavarian separatism? Why was that the moment?
I think my answer is, I don't know whether it's a very sophisticated answer, but I think my answer is that this goes back to his kind of ur-politicization, to his kind of original political ideas, even at the time where other political ideas may have not been that important, or he was still searching about it. There is no doubt that from the time he was a teenager, he is a German Austrian. Or he sees himself as a German who is as a German and Austrian in the same way can be a German and Bavarian or German and Westphalian. So in that thing, he thinks he lives in the wrong state. So that is really the continuity in his political life. So And of course, also it's again what makes him a bit unusual in right-wing politics after the First World War is that precisely while there's this huge movement for bringing power back to Bavaria, Hitler precisely is the guy who wants an all-German movement. It's kind of, in that sense, goes against the political mainstream in Bavaria. And so in that sense, maybe it's not that surprising that it is when someone gets up and basically says Bavaria should be independent, that he really gets worked up. But it's still, I'm glad you asked the question because it's still, and because I have been thinking about still, why is it that if it's really so true what I said earlier, that there's these two fundamental questions as to, or answers to these questions which revolve around anti-Semitism and territory and all that it is of all topics, Bavarian separatism, that really makes Hitler jump up, but probably because that is the deepest sitting and oldest political sentiment in him, which, by the way, goes back to the question of family and upbringing. In that sense, he also is not a typical product of his family, because his at least two of his siblings very much identify themselves with the Habsburg monarchy, which Hitler absolutely hates, and of course also, as you may or may not know, Hitler's half-sister runs the Jewish student canteen in Vienna after the First World War. So in many ways, Hitler is, this is just a kind of by the by, not a typical product of the politicization of his family.
There's this, you had your hand up. Yeah, please.
Yeah, so I was also, like Jamie, struck by your finding that Hitler already has a genocidal vision about Jews already in 1920 to 1921. I was wondering if just you could elaborate on that a bit more and sort of how his ideas about Jews relate to his ideas about territory and imperialism. So in 1920, is this a purely sort of German sort of vision of just making Germany free of Jews, or does he already have this kind of notion of Germany is killing Jews already outside its borders, or sort of establishing this larger territory was going to carry out this genocide, or does this notion of sort of this territorial vision emerge more in sort of the mid-1920s when he sort of understands that the Soviet Union isn't going to disappear? How do you see those sort of notions evolving?
I think Hitler ultimately thinks that the more systematic you can be in removing Jewish influence from Germany, the better. I also think that ultimately, in an ideal world, he would even want to go do a good deed for the world and free the world of the Jews, even though that is not his primary concern. And for a long time, actually, I thought that this was ultimately really just about ideas, and that he would be fine to just drive Jews out of Germany. In fact, my German publishing house rushed out an early translation of the first draft of this book, where you actually get a very different interpretations of Hitler's anti-Semitism, where I was more still saying, well, look, Hitler doesn't really quite know what exactly this entails. This is ultimately about ideas. This is not really this kind of territorial thing, and so on. But then I realized that there are all these pieces of evidence where in private he says it would be best to get rid of all Jews. For instance, in 1923 he gives this interview as a Catalan journalist, and he then asks him kind of off the record, so what are you saying here? Are you saying that you would prefer to kill all the Jews? And Hitler says, obviously I'm paraphrasing here, yes, absolutely, that would be the best thing to do, but I've looked at it from all sides and it's just not possible. So therefore we have got to settle on expulsion. The other piece is that in so I've just a sudden moment of jet lag. Just give me 1 second. In one other occasion, he is he's meeting this right-wing person in Munich, and he's privately saying to him, I think this is 1921, once I'm in power, I will round up Jews in Munich. For instance, in Munich, I will lead them to Marienplatz and the Market Square, and I will hang them. I will let them hang there until they rot. I will then cut them off, and then I will put up the next Jews, and we will do this in every market square of Germany until not a single Jew is being left. The third one is where Hitler is referring to machine gunning Jews and killing Jews. And the fourth one is a slightly more indirect one, which is a response. It's a letter to Rudolf Hess from 1922, so of course Hitler's top 8, where basically kind of eternal friend of this guy basically said, well, look, you guys, meaning Hitler and Hess, you get this wrong. Solving the Jewish question through machine gunning them all is just not the right way to go about it. But I think the context is that they're responding there to a proposal that is the way of dealing with this. And of course, it's difficult to say how do we know that these are not just some kind of violent fantasies. But I would say that from the way he presents these ideas and from the kind of person he is, and the fact precisely that he's not using these violent fantasies in public, strongly suggests that Hitler does believe that would be the best solution. And within the confines of his weird ideas, it kind of makes sense that this would be the most systematic way of solving the problem. And the driving people out of Germany also goes back to doing a good deed for the world might be good for Germany, but would not be good for the world, which I think on one hand Hitler might think is a good thing, because that actually gives them maybe a competitive in this kind of competition of states. But on another hand, I think he also does believe of doing something for humankind, and in that sense, but just like shifting Jews around, you're not going to solve that problem.
On that very point, I'd ask you to go a little further, if you would, into the origins of the extreme and lethal character of Hitler's anti-Semitism. How do you distinguish it from what we might horribly call the normal anti-Semitism, not only of German culture, but of European culture? The anti-Semitic parties, Karl Marx, Martin Luther. With Hitler, anti-Semitism takes on a demonic transcendence that, at least for him and his supporters, begins to justify these extreme measures. Is there a mutation that occurs between what you could call normal anti-Semitism and Hitler's transcendent anti-Semitism? And if so, where do you see it?
Can I code it to that question?
Sure.
Or to what extent did Hitler see this as a device that he could use to get most of the population, who already are somewhat inoculated with anti-Semitism, to his side and further his power?
Of course,
Can I add to that too? So just to take this.
now it will be difficult to remember everything you ask.
Now in a really difficult position. On the one hand, you defined Hitler as a man of ideas. You pointed out first things first for him is Germany. The Jews need to be shoved aside, gotten rid of, because they are an impediment to German greatness because of Jewish capitalism. And then you describe the hanging of the Jews in the market square until they rot, which brings back Julius Oppenheimer, obviously, in Stuttgart, because that's exactly what happened to him in the 18th century. So we're not really talking about a universe of ideas anymore, where you apply something because you want to achieve an end. We are deep somewhere in what you would just call transcendent anti-Semitism. We're into a kind of violence and fantasy that brings back what you said at the beginning. There's a kind of weird psychology there. I was thinking when you were talking first, narcissistic personality disorder, dealing with fantasies and having problems with dealing with fantasies that have exploded. So, man of ideas and this kind of psychological pleasure in violence, there's a contradiction right here. So, how are you going to dig yourself out of the hole that you are?
There's so many questions here, but I don't think that I don't think I dug myself into a hole at all. I think there are two sides of the same medal. He's precisely actually saying, and he says it time and time again, there is no point in a kind of just in an emotional anti-Semitism for its own sake. That's not going to achieve anything. He says the kind of anti-Semitism of pogroms is pointless. The anti-Semitism of the Yud Zeus period is kind of pointless because ultimately it's not going to solve the problem. So this results from him being a man of ideas and of really trying to think that there is something more than just sort of like hating or scapegoating Jews. You really have got to get rid of that Jewish influence once and for all. But of course you can connect that with these kind of primitive violent fantasies and of finding a solution of how you can get rid of all of them. Because he's not just saying, let's hang a few of them and make an example of them. He is saying we have got to continue to do this until not a single Jew in Germany is being left. So I think in that sense, I think this kind of psychological aspect and the aspect of these violent fantasies and this idea of the man of ideas are not mutually exclusive, but they're two sides of the same medal. There were so many aspects to this. Can you remind me what you...
Hitting on that and knowing that the population would be sympathetic to Jew, could he cleverly have used this further to further his career in the scapegoating type of action? I mean, that's one that is frequently talked of.
True, of course, but there are various problems here. I mean, as long as Hitler wants to establish himself as the champion of the radical right, going on about that anti-Semitism helps him, is a competitive advantage. The moment he wants to make a case to the general German public, it no longer helps. Because sure, everyone may have been anti-Semitic, but not anti-Semitic in that way. So therefore, he of course later on, for instance, in the election campaigns of 1932, he doesn't really talk about Jews. But even in this earlier period, of course, the interesting thing here again is he is not thinking somehow, oh, well, everyone thinks that Yud Zeus and the killing of the Yud Zeus was great and hanging a few Jews in the market square is great, therefore let's capitalize on it, because then he would say it publicly. But he's not saying it publicly. Either of you also asked about what differentiates Hitler from the other anti-Semitism is sure, everyone is anti-Semitic, well, not everyone is, but most people would have had some kind of anti-Semitic sentiment in Germany, as would have been true in this country. But the question is, what kind of anti-Semitism are we talking about here? It's even with the anti-Bolshevik anti-Semitism that was most popular in Munich during this time, there was still a space for Jews. One of while researching the book, really most fascinating things was to look into Jewish involvement in Freikorps, in these right-wing militias, that are often presented as the kind of nucleus of National Socialism, even of the SS, of the killing machine of the SS. And I said, well, let's not just look at some examples of Jews in there, but let's actually really look at all the master roles. And I had a student of mine for a master's undergraduate dissertation to go through all these Bavarian muster rolls. And what emerges from that is that Jewish participation in these Freikorps at least matches their percentage in population, and almost certainly well exceeds that. And people have no problems having liberal or conservative Jews amongst the ranks of those kinds of Freikorps, because people don't think there's any problems with those kinds of Jews. People would still think that they would still harbor some kind of anti-Semitic ideas, yet they would have no problems. I mean, we see it in this, of course, a kind of similarity of this in many kinds of races. And people have some kind of ideas about what blacks do, yet they have all these kind of have no problems of working together with some African Americans. So, but for Hitler's anti-Semitism is very different. There is no space left for Jews in this anti-Semitism. Of course, I'm not saying this is a one-of-a-kind anti-Semitism. I'm not saying Hitler is the only person who has this kind of anti-Semitism. Of course, there are other people who have got an absolutely total anti-Semitism where there is no space left for Jews. But Hitler's anti-Semitism is at least different from mainstream anti-Semitism in Munich at that time.
But you're not, see, I'm sorry, but you're
Sure.
not really addressing the question as I heard it and understand it.
Okay.
The question isn't how is it different? The question is where does it come from? Where does that virulent, transcendent anti-Semitism, where does it come from? How is it that Hitler develops that?
Yeah, no, I'm glad you're bringing out it, because that was the next thing I wanted to say. And I think in a way, this leads us back to some of Daniel's or Jamie's question. To some extent, again, we're back to the scarcity of sources, where we can ultimately try to use the surviving pieces of evidence to put them together in the most plausible and probable way. I think what really plays a role here is generally Hitler's general psychological predisposition, also his predisposition towards an all or nothing approach to political problems, where every compromise is a rotten compromise, where if you do find there's no half-baked answers, where Hitler is really trying to understand political problems once and for all, and therefore there are no shades of gray. There are no ways of just somehow blaming the Jews a little bit. Therefore, he's really trying to find kind of the hidden golden reason of why something is happening, and then because of his all or nothing predisposition, where I'm not entirely sure where this kind of all or nothing approach to life comes from, he takes this he zeroes in on an anti-Semitism that, in that sense, is different, because the kind of mainstream anti-Semitism is incompatible with his psychological all or nothing approach to life. I know this is it's not a complete answer, but it's an attempt. How would you answer it?
I don't know, but I think I sharpen it. Where does
The incredible hatred in general, or towards Jews?
I mean, if you want to talk about it as a kind of pathological, incredibly pathological hatred focus in that way, I mean, it seems to warrant a little more explanation.
Are we talking about generally pathological hatred as a category towards any kind of group, or specifically towards the Jews?
I think the question was specifically toward the Jews.
Sure.
Because earlier, as I've read some biographies, there's the same kind of sort of fluidity earlier in his life around some of that, allegedly. But, you know, it develops, and there's a, virulence and toxicity to it that is, what we know. And I don't think not that you can or don't, but I don't think you've really addressed that yet.
I wished I could. I'm not sure whether the sources that we have will allow us to give a conclusive answer beyond to speculate about that. I think the virulence is, I would say it's a combination of two things. One is, this goes back to what I said a few minutes ago, maybe not in a particularly eloquent way, but there's kind of his all or nothing approach to life, and where, of course, you would still have got to push me onto where does his kind of all or nothing approach to life come from, but which would be a different one, which is a different question to why is this specifically directed against the Jews, but there is, of course, the possibility that he generally has got this virulence and in general for all or nothing answers, which would explain that once he settles onto anti-Semitism, it would become a virulent answer. But in which case, what I ultimately have got to answer is, why does he have got this all or nothing approach to life? Where I'm not entirely sure whether I have an answer why he already, as he is a teenager, starts to have this kind of all or nothing approach to life. And I think there we are really squarely back on the question of Hitler's psychological makeup. The other aspect about the virulence of hatred of Jews, I do believe that it's at least plausible to argue that Hitler had specific interactions with Jews that would have at least contributed towards hatred of Jews. But again, the problem is that the evidence is just not good enough. The surviving evidence is just not good enough to really say, without me looking totally ridiculous, to say this is the reason why he was directing his all or nothing hatred towards the Jews in particular. I mean, there are rumors for instance, in Konrad Heiden's book, something that people normally don't pick up on interactions that Hitler had with Jews. Konrad Heiden floats this idea that Hitler once had a Jewish fiancée. There is no evidence that this happens, but it still raises the question, why would this guy who knew all these people so incredibly well from Hitler's context come up with this told story? I would never put this into writing. I also think there is certainly not enough evidence, but if you ask me what are possible ways, would this be a possibility? Sure. Is this the likely reason? Maybe not. But if you really force me, we could talk about issues like that. I've also been asked to look at documents relating to the missing year, where I had to sign a non-disclosure statement, so I can't tell you what's in there. But if it is true what's in there, which I doubt, but if it is true, it would suggest that an interaction with Jews during that time would have had a huge impact on that. As I said, I personally doubt whether the document that I've been asked to look at fully adds up. But if you kind of force me to look into those aspects, I would be dishonest if I did not mention them.
Well, we need...
Sorry?
What was Hitler's age?
23.
There's an adolescent. Well, this has been quite we've exhausted you. It's now 6 p.m. We do need to stop. I just want to say, by way of conclusion, what we've learned, obviously, is from about the depth and the breadth of Tom's own research in his 2 volumes on Hitler, and the difficulty of writing. I know I'm in the stages of writing a biography of as well, and the difficulties in ever getting to know an individual's deepest psychological character, regardless of the wealth of documentation. But also, for those in the public today who read German, I would strongly recommend you look at a recent article in Geschichte und Gesellschaft, which approaches the history of anti-Semitism from the lens of the history of emotions, from disdain to disgust to fear and panic and all of this. And I actually think it's a very useful lens. It has to do with time and it has to do with class. It's not about Hitler, per se, but I think it might provide, for those who are asking these questions, if access to German, because it hasn't come out in English yet, it might be very helpful. In the meantime, I want to thank the Politics and Time program here and at Harvard, as well at the CES, as well as the European Jewry, I think the official word, it's the Jews in Modern Europe Study Group, right? I think after co-chairing it for a year, I should know that. Again, it's been a marvelous hour and almost 2 hours. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for your wonderful talk, despite jet lag. And we all look forward to reading the book. Thank you again.
Thank you so much for coming, and I should also thank the British Academy and the Thyssen Foundation for having sponsored me.